Today is November 1st, 2022. Here in Lubbock, Texas, on the day after Halloween, temperatures hit 71 degrees. The leaves outside of Studio E have begun to turn the mild yellows and oranges of a West Texas fall, and in just a few days will all fall back with daylight savings time. While today's history shapes itself, we're pleased to present the untold story of Mrs. Mary Ann Gallaway, born here in Lubbock, Texas on March 4th, 1952. Hers is a story of serving the Lubbock community, including as a child with the brand new Meals on Wheels program, traveling the world and publishing a book with her husband, and becoming known for her good works in public speaking everywhere from the South Plains to California, China, and elsewhere. Could you introduce yourself for us?
My name is Mary Ann Gallaway. I was born Mary Ann Milliken here in Lubbock, Texas on March 4th, 1952.
Do you remember where you were born, what hospital?
It's the old Taylor Hospital that later became Highland Hospital and later got bought out by, I think, Grace Clinic. So my mother was an RN working at that hospital.
And your mother, is she from the region as well?
My mother, Marie Milliken, was born and raised in Wilson, Texas until she was 16 and moved to Denver City, Texas. They're both about half an hour south of Lubbock. And my father also grew up in Wilson, Texas. They were both the oldest of 7 children. If my mother was still living, she'd be 100 years old as of this month, and my father would be 106. So they both remember Lubbock when it was a little bitty tiny community before it even incorporated as a city for my dad.
How did they end up here in Lubbock?
My mother came here from Denver City to go to nursing school at the old Methodist Hospital. It's now Covenant. During about 1941, during the World War II, my father had joined the Marine Corps back about 1938, and he was stationed overseas. They fell in love, got married. My mother traveled on a train to California, had 11 days with him, and then he went off to war and came back 2.5 years later. And when they came back, they went first to Wayland, or to Plainview, where Dad was in school at Wayland Baptist University. And then they settled in Lubbock, probably around 1951, because I was born here in 1952. My older brother had been born in Plainview.
Did they ever talk about World War II when you were young?
A lot, yeah. My dad's sister her husband was stationed in Pearl Harbor and was there the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. My dad was in the Marine Corps and fought in the Pacific. He served on the islands of Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, all that area. His younger brother fought in Germany, France, in that part of the war. So yeah, my dad's major in university was history. So I got a strong education in World War II. My brother was 6 months old. He's 5 years older than I am. 6 months old, my mother got tuberculosis and was in bed for 5 years. That's how you treated it back then, about 4.5 years. And finally, after she got well from that, then they had me.
Was she in a tuberculosis hospital or
No,
at home?
She was at home. Partly, I think it was because she was a nurse, and her nursing background, the doctors knew she'd do exactly what she was supposed to do. Tuberculosis is treated now with a drug that you take every day for a year. But that's, it was a lot of bed rest back then.
Did she completely recover?
Yes, yeah, she did. And then she went on to work as a nurse here in Lubbock at Taylor Hospital in Highland. And when I was 13, my mother had an opportunity to work for the City of Lubbock Health Department. And so from 13 to 20, the next 7 years, she worked for the health department. And then in 1969 is when the whole idea of home health agencies occurred in the United States. And it was a growing field, and a gentleman who had met my mother through the health department said, I want to start a home health agency here in Lubbock. And it was one of the first in the state of Texas. And so my mother started this health department and had been going for about 2 years, the home health agency, where nurses go into the homes of patients and give them minimal nursing care so that they don't have to be in a nursing home. And she'd been doing that about 2 years. It was 1971. I was a freshman at Tech, and I had a part-time job there working in the office. And I remember we were having a break in the conference room, and I was there with the 4 nurses that were on my mom's staff. And my mom came in from a meeting she'd gone to in Austin, and she said, I heard about this new program called Meals on Wheels, and she described it to them and said, Lubbock needs that. One of you guys needs to go home tonight and think about this, and it can't be part of our home health agency. Meals on Wheels needs to be a separate owned organization. So come back tomorrow and tell me which one of you is going to resign from this home health agency and start running Meals on Wheels. And the next morning, one of those nurses named Mary Williams walked in and said, Marie, I think I'm supposed to be the one to help head up Meals on Wheels. And so if you look into the history books of Meals on Wheels here in Lubbock, Mary Williams was the president that started, and they had a board. My mother was on the board and instrumental with helping bring the idea to Lubbock. And at that time, you could apply for federal funds. But some cities did that, some didn't. And my mother was adamant that Lubbock would never have federal support. She said, no, Lubbock people will take care of their own. And we don't want to have to deal with all the federal bureaucracy that comes with federal money. Because we want to be able to do things we feel like we're supposed to do for the people we're taking care of. So that's how it started. The first time they served meals, there were 12 people on the rolls. Because I was there. I helped deliver the first set of meals. And then I think they served 500 or 600 or 700 a day, 5 days a week now.
Well, Lubbock before the age of 16?
Before the age of 16. School. I grew up, I went to Bayless Elementary, and then Atkins Junior High, and then Monterey High School. I remember in the summer it was hot, and there was dirt. There's always been dirt and sand and dust in Lubbock. And at the age of 6, we discovered that I'm allergic to the dirt of West Texas, because my hands would break out, and my feet would break out, and blisters, and I'd have to go to a dermatologist and have these treatments. And so I had to wear closed-toed shoes in the summer. That was a real hassle for kids. That's one of the biggest memories of the summertime as a kid in Lubbock. It was hot and dusty, and I tried to avoid the dust as much as possible because I was allergic to it. And people will say, well, man, what would really happen? You get these blisters on your hands, and then my hands would turn the color of this shirt. And when your hands and your feet are as red as this shirt, you can't walk or use your hands very well. So those are some of my early childhood memories.
How did you stay cool if you couldn't wait around in one?
Air conditioning in our house. We always had air conditioning, and swimming pools. So I go swim and play, but I didn't do a lot. In the evenings, when it cools off, I might play outside and stuff. But the heat of the day, I didn't do a lot of playing outside because it was just, it's too painful if I had a breakout on my hands or my feet. So, and I remember going to school. I liked school. I was a good student. I was in Girl Scouts, brownies and Girl Scouts and all that. What else? Christmas was always fun. In Slayton, my brother had 2 younger brothers who lived in Slayton, Texas with their wives and kids, and so we'd get together with relatives Christmas time and cousins. And, but I was pretty introverted, pretty much a very, very shy kid. And so I liked playing with my cousins, but I didn't like it when, in Southern culture back then, you always greet everybody with hugs and kisses and all that. Didn't like that. I remember one time I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and I remember my mother telling me before we went into my aunt's house, now I'm going to tell them not to hug you today, so don't worry, you can come on in. I remember that, because I was a little kid that didn't want to be hugged. But life was pretty okay, I remember the fact that it was segregated until 1964. So I was about 12 years old when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. I remember that. I was in the 6th grade. It was noon. I remember the boy who came in from having gone home to school for lunch, and he came back in and he said, "Kennedy's been shot." And we were all like, "You lie all the time, Charlie, there's no way." And then our teacher came in looking white as a sheet. She said, "Everybody sit down." And then the principal came on and announced that Kennedy had been assassinated. That was a Friday at noon. We all talked about it the rest of the day. And then that night, we already had scheduled, we were going to my aunt and uncle's house in Slayton. My cousins and I, my parents were talking about it, my cousins and I were talking about it. I was talking about that in 64, and then I remember shortly after, when Johnson's president, but in honor of Kennedy, they passed the integration of schools. We all talked about that. Schools becoming integrated, and we were all for it. One neat historical fact about this part of the country, when my dad was at Wayland, which was probably in 49 or 50 or 51, we'd have to check with Wayland Baptist University, there was a black guy from the area who applied to go to school at Wayland, and that's back when all the schools were segregated. And they took it to the student body at Wayland. This guy fought in the war with you guys, because almost everybody there were GIs, and said, "We're going to vote." And the vote was 100% to accept this young guy at Wayland. And Dad says, it's probably the first integrated university in the United States, because it was integrated from that point on. And it was either 50 or 51. It was before I was born.
So it was before tech.
49 and 50. Tech's, yeah. So I was shocked. My dad told me that when we came back in 2000 to take care of my parents. And he told me that about 01 or 2. And I was like, wow, you need to look that up. So I had already experienced that with my dad. And my dad said, my parents had taught me from a very young age, treat everybody equal. If somebody, because my mother was a nurse and worked full-time, my dad worked full-time, about every couple of weeks somebody would clean house. And sometimes it was a Spanish lady, sometimes it was a black lady, sometimes it was a white lady, And one day, and I don't remember if the lady was black or Hispanic, and I was probably 6 or 7, and my mother thought I had been rude to that lady. And I was about to get the spanking of my life. And Leigh said, no, that's not what she said. No, she was not disrespectful. And she said, okay. That's good. She said, you never treat anybody with disrespect. Anyone who steps a foot in our house, you treat with dignity and respect at all times. It doesn't matter what color they are. So I was 6 years old. We're talking, 1958. That was my parents' attitude. So when integration came in the schools in 1964, my parents were all for it. I was all for it. And watched it happen. I remember when I was at Monterey, there was one black kid in the whole school. And I graduated in the largest graduating class from Monterey High School. We had 805 people in our senior class. So there was about over 2,000 students there, one black young man. But everybody liked him. He was a nice guy. But integration came slowly and progressed. But we were for it.
Were there people in Lubbock who were not for it?
Oh, sure. That was part of the society then. The transition had to occur. But my parents, as I looked back on it in life, and I realized how blessed I was that I had parents who were so, not prejudiced. And I was taught that from a very young age. And I worked with internationals for the last 45 years, 50 years, from all countries. And it's just people are people. And the more I've traveled, the more countries I've been in, the more internationals I've worked with, it's just people are people. There's good people and there's bad people, but it has nothing to do with their skin color. It has to do with the character inside of them. And that's what my parents taught me. And, people in West Texas learn just like other people. The values that, when people say nothing's changed, so much has changed. I went to segregated schools till I was in the 6th, 7th grade, because that's the way schools were. But from 1964 on, they said, no, we're going to start integrating them. And it took a lot in other cities. It didn't take that much in Lubbock. They just started busing them, and it just happened. We didn't have the kind of problems they had in Alabama or Georgia. But, you know, if somebody from East Lubbock may have different feelings about what happened, but that was my experience, was that I knew that my parents were accepting, and my parents were accepting and treated all people with dignity and respect. So I knew what was expected of me, and I knew how much trouble I'd be in if I ever did anything different from the time I was really small.
Can you tell us your earliest memory?
Earliest memory. That's a loaded question. Nah. I'm trying to think. I remember our house on 53rd Street. On 61st Street. I remember, I remember Christmas. I remember my older brother and I had different bedrooms, but on Christmas Eve, he had bunk beds. So he'd sleep on the top bed and I'd sleep on the bottom bed. And I remember, like 3-4 years old, the fact that they put a clock in the room, and we couldn't wake our parents up before 6 a.m. So if we woke up before 6, we'd sit there and watch the clock tick. That's some of my earliest memories, and just the fun of Christmas. I don't know if I remember anything before that. I remember, it was 4 or 5. There's a lady next door that took care of me when my mom was working and my dad was at work. And she had a husband. My dad's name was Raymond and his name was Raymond. And I remember he died. And what I remember is they took me to the viewing at the funeral home when I was like 5 years old. And I remember my dad holding me up so I could see him in the casket. And I was like, okay, that's what looks like somebody died. It's all right. Just memories of the yard and playing with my brother and stuff like that.
Did you have any nicknames growing up?
My dad called me Susie. Susie Q. There's an old song about Susie Q. And every once in a while he called me that. But that's the only nickname I've ever had. I was really not a nickname kind of person.
Who taught you how to ride a bike?
My dad. Probably my dad and my brother may have helped some. I don't remember not knowing how to ride a bike. Yeah. It's not a big, strong memory.
Who taught you how to swim?
6 years old, my mother took us to swimming lessons. She was the oldest of 7 brothers and sisters, and never got to learn to swim, and she was adamant we were going to know how to swim, and we couldn't go swimming with anybody or any group unless we knew how to swim, and she was confident that we were good swimmers. So at the age of 12, I passed junior life saving, and I said, that's as far as I can go, Mom, until I'm 16, because you can't get senior life saving until you're 16. I said, okay, now you can go swimming without having to have me watch you. Because she'd seen too many families crushed by children that drowned.
How old were you when you learned that Santa wasn't real?
Probably about 7 or 8. I figured it out because I found where Mother hid the presents. And I was like, okay, this is how it be. But it didn't really crush me or anything. I just thought, because I think one of the things my parents had said is that they had talked about St. Nicholas, who was a real person in Europe, and the whole story of St. Nicholas and how this person had given gifts to children. And he said the spirit of Santa is from St. Nicholas and what this person did at that period in history. So we give gifts. But they always, when we put our Christmas tree up, Dad would talk about the fact that, God's greatest gift to us was his son who loves us. And that's the greatest gift of Christmas. And that's what Christmas is about. The greatest gift of Christmas is that God loved us so much to send his son who loves us. And So we give gifts to show love to each other. But he would always, before we would open gifts on Christmas morning, we'd always read the Christmas story out of the Bible about the fact that God, God sent his son to love us, to be born. And that's what Christmas is about. That's the day Jesus was born and came into the world. And so that's the meaning of Christmas to me. That's the true meaning of Christmas. It's not just a party time. It's not just giving gifts. And it's why do you give the gifts? You give the gifts because the greatest gift was already given to us.
Who was your best friend growing up?
Or my brother. Then two of my cousins, close to a couple of cousins. And I had a couple of friends that, with the Girl Scouts. And then I'd be at church and I'd have friends in church. No really close friend until high school. I developed a close friend when I was 16 years old. A friend named Alana, and we're friends to this day. I'm going to be on a trip next week and be at her house Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. So we've been friends over 50 years. Because you didn't ask my age on that thing, but I'm 70 years old. Yeah. So we were laughing about that. It's like, you can't say you're 39 anymore, Alana. We've been friends for 53 years. So, yeah, long-term friendships are interesting because when you're 16 years old to 21, we went to tech together, 22, 23, you talk about your dreams and your visions and what am I going to do with my life and will I get married and will I have kids and all that. And at 70, looking back, you see what you done with your life. You see your children, you see your grandchildren, and you see how life moves on. How many of those things came true, how many of them didn't. Where are your regrets? Where are the good parts? But to maintain friendships over time, that's kind of a neat thing. And sometimes when people are making friends here in their days in university, you don't know who will be that long-term friend. But as the years progress and you see what it takes to keep a friendship, because I've lived in California and I lived in Canada, and then I came back to Texas. And he weighed 98 pounds when he died because he lost most of his digestive system in the shooting. And so that was the first personal, like my immediate family. I had lost grandparents and stuff before that. I guess I lost a grandmother when I was 17. And that struck me pretty hard because that was the first one. But she died of a heart attack. And I was out at Girl Scout camp near here in Crosbyton. And I came back from there for the funeral and see family. And she died 2 weeks before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in the summer of 1969. Because we were all sitting around after the funeral at my uncle's house and talking about the fact that, look at that, if Grandma had lived 2 more weeks, she moved from the Oklahoma Indian Territory in a covered wagon at the age of 12 to Lubbock, Texas, and if she'd lived 2 more weeks, she'd seen a man walk on the moon. So what had happened in her 75 years of life? So that's a strong memory of surrounded by a death.
Were you affected by the moonwalk as well?
Well, just the fact that it was incredible. Here it was 1969, and I knew that Grandmother had come in a covered wagon, and my dad was born in 1916. You do the math on that, and he used to talk about, they didn't have refrigerators. They had the ice boxes where you put, the ice truck would come by and you get the big little ice and put it in the ice box to keep your food cold. And I have a picture of my dad on, when he was 2, sitting on the running board of their Model T Ford. That, it was 1918. Cars didn't start going around until 1906 or 1908. And so, 1900, you didn't have very many cars. Wright Brothers was in 1906 or 7. Airplanes. And suddenly it's 1969, and now we've got air travel and airplanes, and everybody's got a car, and nobody uses a horse and buggy much unless you're on a farm out around here, and somebody's going to the moon? Somebody's walking on the moon in 60 years, 69 years? That's incredible. And one of the things that always struck me as a kid growing up in church and hearing people talk about in the book of Revelation, it talks about how in the end times the world will get smaller. I remember thinking as a little kid, well, how can you take the earth and make it smaller? We can't make the earth smaller. But suddenly, you've got air travel, cars and trains and cars and airplanes and going to the moon. The world is getting smaller. We're a global society now. We're not just one little country. And I feel that all the time, having worked in and out of China for 20 years. You get on a plane and 13 and a half hours later you're in Beijing. I mean, you're just like, the world's littler. So,
Can you talk about some of your work in China or outside of China?
We started going to China in 2003. And my husband was invited by a friend to go over there because my husband was hurt when he was 18 years old in an electrical accident, 13,000 volt power line accident, and he was a high school senior in March of his senior year, had a part-time job after school on the weekends. It was a weekend situation where he was hurt, and he spent a year and a half in the hospital and had 38 reconstructive surgeries, and 55% of his body had been third-degree burns. So the doctors told his parents he wouldn't live 24 hours, and the pastor said, our job is to pray and we'll see what God decides. And 3 days later, one doctor came in and said, okay, if we take him into surgery and I amputate his right arm and left hand, maybe he'll live. So they took him into surgery, and that was the first of 38 surgeries, a year and a half in the hospital. And he recovered. And he went to university, got a degree in engineering, and he got a degree in theology. And we met 9 years after the accident and got married. Well, years went by, and in 2001, had the chance to go to China. And in about 2008, after the big earthquake, they were needing, we helped with grief recovery with our Chinese friend. And in schools, they needed motivational speakers to help encourage kids because they'd had a one-child policy for over 20 years. And so Randy would come in and do his never give up speech. Don't give up. The teachers are mad at you, or your parents are mad at you, you make a bad grade, don't kill yourself. Don't give up. Never give up, because look what I went through. And I got through, and I went to university, and I got a degree, and I got another degree, and I got married, and I have 2 kids, and I have 4 grandkids, so don't give up. And everywhere Randy would speak, the suicide rate would drop. So we would have many, many invitations in China. So between 2008 and 2019, we would go a couple of months in the fall, a couple of months in the spring, and speak between 40 and 60 times in different schools. So we've probably been to China over 30 times, and Randy spoke a lot of times. And we've got invitations to go back someday, maybe. If COVID lifts where I can go back to China and have a visit, I'll go back again once or twice. I'm getting older. It's a little harder when you're 70 to go to China, to go anywhere. But it's been good. We've got students here. 2 of my students from China graduated from Tech this spring. One graduated from Tech, and one finished some leveling courses, and they were accepted to occupational therapy school at USC. And so I helped one of them move out there this summer, and they're now at OT school. And there's other Chinese students here going to school that I know. So I like working with. The nice thing about working with Chinese kids is they really respect their elders, so they treat me like royalty just because I'm old. A little different than Southern culture, than West U.S. culture. Something I think our students need to learn. That's mainly the thing with China. It was really good to see the suicide rate would drop anywhere Randy would speak, and then after 4 years, then the principals would say, "Can you come back?" because I got a new bunch of students and they need to hear you talk. And now there's less stress because about 3 years ago they lifted the one-child policy. So now they can have 2 or 3. And in some areas they can have more than that. So that's been a good thing. And we've helped some in the education, getting teachers to go do seminars in the schools. They help with like Bloom's taxonomy and classroom management, things like that. And the schools, the teachers that we've taken to some different places have helped the schools there in China. So it's been an interesting learning curve and being in and out of schools. So,
Can you talk about meeting your husband?
meeting my husband. Yeah, when I was here at Tech, I was involved at Baptist Student Ministry. And it's at 13th and Avenue X. And I was a junior at Tech, and they were having some special people come in. We were having a week-long emphasis through the Baptist Student Ministry to reach students at Tech. And they had different people coming in to assist for that week. And at the Baptist Student Ministry program, if you graduate from university anywhere in Texas, you can apply to be like an intern at another university's Baptist Student Ministry program for a year. So Randy had worked at on another campus for a year, and then they asked him, because of his unique story and losing his arms, they asked him would he travel to different campuses for a semester. And so he said sure. So they'd had him traveling around all over the state of Texas. So he had him come to Texas Tech for a week. And so I was part of a leadership team at the Baptist Student Ministries here, and he came to my campus with about 10 other people, and that's how we met. And so the very last night that we were in town, we'd spoken at the old Coliseum there, and he was one of the speakers there. And then about 10 or 15 of us went to Denny's for dinner, 9 o'clock at night. And so that was when we had our first date. The interesting thing about that evening was he knew he was on a date, but I didn't. Because I just thought I was giving him a ride to go with the group to the meeting. But he had had an agreement with his boss, because when he'd spent a year at the other campus, the rule was you couldn't date girls at the campus you were working at. So he said, I'll travel all over Texas, but if I meet somebody I want to date, since I'm traveling to different places, can I date them? He said, well, you asked the BSU director, would it cause any problems in their group if you do that? So he'd gone over to ask my BSU director permission to have a date with me, unbeknownst to me, and that was our first date. That's when I started getting to know my husband. And that was about a year later when I graduated from Tech in May of 75, and we got married in June of 75. So that's how we met. Long distance dating. We never lived in the same city until the day we got married.
What was that like?
Well, that's back before cell phones and text messages and all the stuff the kids can do now. So, and back then, to make a phone call out of the city of Lubbock cost money. So, it was expensive. We had long distance phone calls, and I'd go to Dallas for the weekend and stay with his parents, or his mom, her house, or he'd come to Lubbock for the weekend and stay there with my parents and me. About every 6 weeks, we had a meeting that we both wanted to attend. We'd be there at the same time. So it was interesting and definitely more expensive than dating in the same city. But it worked out, you know. I'd always firmly believed that from the time I was 12 or 13 years old, one of my strongest convictions is it's what's on the inside that counts, that makes you the person you are. And the outer appearance is not what's important. And my mother, being a nurse, had seen all kinds of disabilities. And so I was a nurse, I was a medical biology major. I had planned to go to medical school. So I was into medical things. So when I saw him, the first time I ever met him, the memory of him, you know, I saw the artificial arms, and I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I wonder how that works. You know, I was just very analytical and logistical. I was just curious. So, as we the relationship grew, and when he was thinking about wanting to ask to marry me, he said, you need to ask your parents, do my arms bother them? And I said, I don't know how to ask my parents that without getting myself in a lot of trouble. He says, because my mother's going to be mad at me if I ask her that question. And he kept pushing, you got to ask. I said, oh, you're fine. So I asked him one day, he'd come visit for the weekend, and he was at the house. We'd gone to church, and I was in the kitchen with my mom. She's finishing up Sunday lunch. I said, Mom, I've got to ask you a question that Randy wants me to ask you. I said, this is not from me. Remember, Randy wants me to ask you this. And so I said, Randy wants to know if we were to consider marriage, do his arms bother you? And she just like, well, of course not. She said, I've always said I want you to marry a committed Christian who's a hard worker, who will provide for you, who loves the Lord. And he does all that. No, absolutely not. But I had to phrase it very carefully to keep myself from getting in big trouble. So those are some of my strongest memories of life here and Randy and my parents.
So you said you wanted to be a nurse at first. What was your first job?
I wanted to be a doctor at first.
A doctor.
By the time I was 10. First job was working for my mother's home health agency. When I was at Tech, I worked there a couple of years. I would work 2-3 afternoons a week and stocking the medical supplies for the nurses to come in and check out their medical supplies that they needed to take when they would make the patient visits. And then I concentrated more on school. That's what my mother wanted me to do, both my parents. And then I graduated with a switched degree in microbiology. In '75 we got married and moved to Dallas. And then I went another year at Texas Women's. I had to take 2 classes. Well, it was a junior college. 2 classes I needed to apply to nursing school, because when I didn't get into medical school, because they said to all of us, 75% of all of you won't get in because so many people are applying to medical school right now. And I was so introverted, I was too chicken to apply because I was too shy to go through the oral interview. So I thought, okay, I'll go to nursing school instead. So then the next 2 years, I got into nursing school at TW and finished bachelor's in nursing. And Randy finished his degree at Southwestern Seminary. And then he got a job offer in Southern California to work with students on campuses, on 6 or 7 different campuses in Southern California. And he would base out of California Baptist University in Riverside, California. So we went there to check on his job and to see about possibly buying or renting a house. And that was in April. And we met the dean of students, and he said, what do you do? And I said, I just graduated from nursing school. I guess I'll be applying to nursing school here, the nursing job somewhere. And about 10 minutes later, I get a call from a different dean, and he said, the student life dean wants to talk to you. So I went to that office. He said, we need to hire a school nurse, our director of our health center. Would you consider the job? And so we talked a while. I said, yes. So I walked out of his office with a job as Director of Health Services at California Baptist University. So that was my first full-time paying job, 1978 at Cal Baptist. I did that for 8 years. And then the academic dean called up and said, we have this health class, and professor usually teaches that is on sabbatical, and we figured you're a nurse and you ought to be able to teach health, so you want to teach the health class? I said, sure. So I taught there for 8 years also before we moved to Canada. So my first full-time paid job was California Baptist University.
Did you like it?
I loved it. I loved it a lot. I liked teaching. I liked working with students. Randy was Baptist Student Ministries Director, so we always had trips and retreats and events with students, and then I'd see them healthy in my class, and then I'd see them sick when they'd come into my health center. It's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'd see the way people look different when they're sick. And then I'd been there doing that job about 4 years when they started the first master's program at Cal Baptist, which was in clinical psychology. And I started taking psychology classes part-time, because I realized that half of what I was seeing in my health center were psychosomatic illnesses. And so I thought, I need some more psychology to be able to deal with the psychological side of what I'm seeing when kids come in and talk to me. And so I did that part-time and then finished that degree in 1988 with a master's in psych. So one of the tests that my professors back then, we had to know backwards and forwards, was the Myers-Briggs, the personality test. And so I've been giving that test for over 40 years. And 35 years, like that. And so it's kind of neat to have that in your tool belt, something you could do with students. So,
What brought you to Canada?
there was a gentleman in Canada named Henry Blackaby, who was the director of missions for the Vancouver area. And he realized there were pastors there at these churches in Vancouver, but there was nobody working consistently with students. There was a lot of universities in the greater Vancouver area. And he had been a guest speaker many times at Cal Baptist, and he knew Randy and I. And he contacted Randy. He said, would you consider moving to Canada? He said, we don't have any money. You'll have to raise your own support, but we need you to come up here and work with students. And so we prayed about it, thought about it, I thought, okay. And we started fundraising and resigned 2 full-time jobs, and 4 months later moved to Canada in December, I don't know, 86, I think. And in the meantime, our last 2 years in California, we'd adopted our 2 children. So our son was 2 and our daughter was 9 months old when we moved to Canada. So I got up to Canada and we lived, he worked with students there. And my kids were so young then, I decided I'll just help with the students, and Randy not try to get a nursing degree or a counseling degree until they're a little bit older. We were in Vancouver 3 years, 2.5 years, when the Canadian Baptists asked us to move across the country from Vancouver to Toronto and open up. They wanted Randy to open up ministry with students in Toronto. He says there's like millions of students there. There's 17 universities, and we need to open up some work with students there. So we packed up again and moved 3,000 miles east and lived in a suburb of Toronto called Milton, which was really nice, about 35,000 people. And he worked on opened up work on 7 different campuses the 10 years we were in the Toronto area. And I basically did more and more counseling, did some part-time counseling there, and then, I was like, between the kids and all the students, the student work, I was full-time. But I would always use the Myers-Briggs for retreats and seminars and things like that. It helps people understand communication and conflict, and when you realize there's 16 different types of people out there, and you're one of them, and how do you relate to these other 15? That's the goal. To understand yourself better, to understand how to relate to other people better. So we would do all that, work with them. And then we came back in 2000 to Lubbock.
Were you living here when the tornado came, 1970?
May 11th, 1970. I was a senior in high school. Because our first question was, are we going to have graduation? And we did. But it was something. Yeah, I was here. I was in Lubbock. Our house was on 53rd Street. And my older brother, 1970. Yeah, we were on the house on 53rd. My older brother was actually downtown, the downtown area, so it took a while to get a hold of him, and he finally was able to call us and say he was okay, but he was in that part of town where it hit. And I remember the devastation and the pictures, and driving there later and seeing it, and it was just, 23 people, I think, or 26 people died, and how, like, where on 10th Street, the big Coliseum thing, and not the Coliseum, word they use for it, by the library there. Anyway, all that area, they're there because all those houses were wiped out. And I remember the fact that the tornado set down on University and 10th Street. That's where it came down. And if it had set down 1 block further west, it would have taken out 2 major dorms back then. The administration buildings now, but they were full of students back then. It set down right on the scene. And then it took the roof off of the building, that apartment kind of house dorm place right there at 10th and University. Took the roof off of that building and then went on down and started destroying small houses. And then it got to, there's a really tall building, and it twisted that building, which sat empty for years and years and years. And they finally decided it was structurally sound, so they opened it back up. But when it twisted that building and then it turned and started going due north, and if it had gone 1 block further east, it would have wiped out a small hospital. Those were some of the amazing facts that came out of that tornado that I remember. Is how God just stopped it from where it came down, and then suddenly it just turned and went north through a bunch of not houses anymore, just grain buildings or stuff like that, industrial type buildings. So I remember, and we didn't get to have high school graduation. And then COVID affected my 50th high school reunion. I don't know if they ever had that. But,
How did you make it through COVID?
We had our plane tickets to fly back to China on March 8th. COVID hit. Our Chinese partner was in China. And he barely got out of China on February 7th. And when we realized, okay, it's going to shut down. And so when COVID hit from March of 2020 to September of 2020, it was kind of like, we haven't been home March and April and spring for 17 years. This is kind of a novel experience. We had been traveling so much, speaking and raising funds and going to China, that just being home together was kind of a blessing. And so not having to go anywhere, not having to be on the road. So that was the blessing in disguise for us from March until September. Our 45th wedding anniversary was June of 2020, and restaurants had just opened back up some. And so we went to Roadhouse, and Randy had this girl take a picture of us at Roadhouse. And then in September 9th was Randy's 73rd birthday. And that was right after the Labor Day weekend. On Saturday afternoon of the Labor Day weekend, Randy got sick. And we were like, okay. And I watched him get worse and worse between 2 and 6 p.m. At 6 p.m. I took him to the emergency room, and at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, he's in emergency surgery and for perforated colon, and he died 5 days later. So my husband died on September 10th, the day after his 73rd birthday, and during that COVID time. So it was like, it was where I could be in there with him, but nobody else could be with me. And my sister-in-law came from Fort Worth, and she was there a little bit. And that was just kind of... So COVID, the first part of COVID for me it was a blessing because we had time together. And then I lose Randy in 6 days. And the next 4 months I was just kind of like on autopilot. And like, okay, I'm going to go do this, and then I'm going to do this, and then Thanksgiving will come and I'm going to do this. And Christmas is coming, and I'll fly up to Casper, Wyoming to see my son and daughter-in-law and the 4 grandkids. And as I told my Chinese students in January of 21, COVID's still going on, I said, I came to a decision. I said, I can either stay home and cry and be sad the rest of my life, or I can keep doing what Randy and I were doing, and helping you guys and working with Chinese people, students, and helping them know that there's a God that loves them. Because, I don't want to get to heaven someday and have Randy come up to me and say, why'd you sit home and cry all that time? You knew what I wanted you to do. You knew what you were supposed to be doing. Why'd you cry? So I said, okay, well, Lord, just help me get through this. And so I just kept traveling, meetings in South Texas, first weekend in March, first weekend in November, and I go down and I see different donors for our ministry in China and our work. And I keep working with the students that are here, because at that time, when COVID was gone, there were at least 5 or 6 students I've known, 2 of them since they were 14 years old in China. And she just graduated in May and she's 21, you know. So people you've known 7 or 8 years, yeah, I thought I just want to keep doing whatever I'm supposed to be doing with them. That's how I got through COVID, and more for me, the death of my husband.
Can you tell me 3 pairs of shoes that have been important to you over your life?
3 pairs of shoes? That's a tricky question. Okay, the first pair of shoes that comes to mind is when I was 10 years old, was a pair of cowboy boots. My mom didn't think that's back in the day when girls didn't wear cowboy boots. You know, boys wore cowboy boots. But we'd gone shopping for Christmas because my brother wanted a pair of boots. He was 15, I was 10. And we were looking at these boots, and I saw this pair I really liked. I got to try them on and all that. My dad let me try them on. My mom's kind of standing there, not happy. I could try them all that. And Christmas morning, opened that present from my dad, and it was those cowboy boots. And I'll never forget it. People always say, well, you know, that's the most memorable gift I ever got, because as a 10-year-old.
Did you want to talk about the 2 other pairs of shoes?
Okay, the boots my dad gave me, and then shoes. Probably, well, I had to wear corrective shoes all my life, well, till like I was 12, because I was totally flat-footed and no arches, so I had to build up the arches. So I remember having to go and pick, back in that day and age, they didn't have pretty shoes. The corrective shoes that had tie and support and good for feet, either solid white, solid black, black and white, or brown and white. Those were your choices. So each year I'd pick a different pair of shoes. So I remember that. Then at age 12 I was like, oh no, I'm not going to do this anymore, you know, teenage years. And then my feet would hurt when I would wear shoes that didn't have support. And then finally, when I entered tech, when Nikes came out, like in 1970, 71, where you could get, you know, tennis shoes that were supportive, that was a revolution for me, because I could buy a pair of Nikes and they were supportive and they looked good and they looked like everybody else's shoes. And I was like, hallelujah. And you could walk across Tech campus. I'd park near the BSM on 13th and X and walk all the way to the biology building. It was a 15-minute walk. And I could do that, and if I wore those supportive Nikes, my feet wouldn't hurt. Or if I wore the corrective support shoes I'd had to wear all my life, my feet wouldn't hurt. But if I tried to walk without that, in 5 minutes my feet would hurt. So it makes a big difference when you have to have supportive shoes on your feet. So that's kind of my memory of shoes. Beautiful, elegant, fancy shoes and heels and all that mess. No, my feet, I wouldn't have been able to walk. You know, so that was always a challenge. I had to have major reconstructive foot surgery 4 years ago, and to rebuild, to work on the tendon on my right foot. And then I just got back from a trip to France, and we had to walk an average of 15,000 steps a day for 6 days. And I did it. I was like, yes. But my shoes are very supportive.
When did you last sing to yourself?
I have no clue. Not that much of a singer. Yeah.
When did you last cry?
When did I last cry? Well, I cried a lot when my husband died. And grief is intermittent. So I know I've cried since then, and I've cried at different times. I don't remember exactly the last time, but it'll just hit you, and all of a sudden you'll cry. And it's like, okay, you cry for a little while and you're done. For 5 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever. And then I go on. And I don't fight it, you know. It's the advantage of the degree in counseling. I know, don't fight it. Let the emotion be emotion. And it just, the one thing I've discovered in my 2 years of having, you live with somebody for 45 years and 3 months, and then they're gone in 5 days. The shock of that is overwhelming. But as I look back on these 2 years, it's like grief. The funeral home I was at, I saw this, they've got this carved in a stone in there. It says, grief is the price you pay for great love. It's really true. It's like, how could I prevent that depth of grief? The only way to have prevented that was to have been and never had the 45 years with Randy. And I wouldn't trade the 45 years with Randy just to not have the grief of missing him. So you miss him, but my hope is in the Lord. My hope is in the scriptures, the Bible, that someday I'm in heaven again with him, and that's where he is now. So, and I know I've had enough experiences and enough life experiences and places where people who've been to heaven and come back, and they've seen the Lord, and they know it's real. So I have no doubt that's where Randy is. And he's alive, and he's happy, and he's not hurting, and he's got arms, and that's going to be interesting when I see him in heaven someday. It's like, because the Lord says you're fully restored, and it's like, he'll have his arms. What a phenomenon. I've got pictures of him when he was a little boy with his arms, but I never knew him with arms. So,
If someone made a movie about your life, what would it be about, and who would play you?
I think it would be about Randy and I's journey together. I mean, they talked about trying to get that book made into a movie, so we've thought about that before. An actress that I think could play me would be Sandra Bullock, because she did such a good job in The Blind Side. Something like that. A person who can be tough when you need to be tough and kind when you need to be kind. I try to do that. But if it was about me, it's that transition from being an extreme introvert. When I was 17 years old, I made the decision to continue to talk because I was so shy and so afraid of people. And the reason I decided to keep talking, I said, now Lord, you told me that you love people, and it's my job to tell people that you love them. So you got to help me learn how to talk to people because they scare me to death. So that's been my transition to the point where, 3 years ago, if you'd seen me and been on traveling with me in China, every time we spoke, I'd stand in front of the audience, whoever they were. Is it 100 people? Is it 1,000 people? Is it 2,000 people? Is it 5,000 people? I could stand and talk in front of audiences of thousands. From being that 17-year-old kid who was too scared to speak. And that's the story of transformation. And for me, it's transformation, letting God work in your life and take you through your journey and never leaving you.
Is there anything about yourself that your friends and family would be surprised to learn?
I don't think so. I'm pretty open and pretty me. I don't think so. Maybe some of the ones that have never seen me speak that well in front of audiences. We have a fundraising banquet for our work every September, and my two partners and I, the three guys and I, each had 15 minutes to share. And afterwards, 2 or 3 different long-term donors came up and said, man, you're really good. You spoke really well. It's like, they seemed surprised. I said, yeah, well, I didn't have to talk before. Randy was here to do it. They said, yeah, that's right. So I was fine being behind the scenes. But that's the most surprise I've seen recently. It's people saying, wow, yeah, I can't hide behind Randy anymore. He's not here to hide behind.
What's your favorite photograph of your life?
One of my favorite photographs is the last pictures that were made of Randy and I in China, because he mentioned to a friend we need some professional pictures made. And she said, oh, well, my brother's a professional photographer. So she calls the next day and says, okay, Sunday night, 6 o'clock, come over to my office. My brother's going to set up his light, his studio, and he'll take the pictures. So they took those pictures, and that's one of my favorites. Another one is Randy and I on the Great Wall of China. Some of those things, and others are ones with me and the students that I've worked with for so long. And there's a couple that I really like with my grandkids, but they tend to pop around and be everywhere. But that last professional photograph made of Randy and I think captured us. And so that's what I really like about it.
Thank you so much for talking with us. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.
This has been a conversation with Mary Ann Gallaway, a resident of the South Plains for 70 years. We'd like to thank her for sharing her story with us, and we'd also like to express our gratitude to the sponsors of Lubbock's Untold Stories, the Helen Jones Foundation, Inc., and the Department of English at Texas Tech University, as well as our community partners and supporters, Lubbock's Adult Activity Centers, the Louise Hopkins Underwood Center for the Arts, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, the Special Collections Library and Sowell Collection at Texas Tech, and Texas Tech Public Media, KTTZ. We hope you'll join us next time for another Untold Story.